I was standing on my family ranch's front porch, clutching the yellow notice that was taped to our fence post as if it were announcing someone's death. The wind had partially torn it loose, making it flutter against the aged wood like some twisted prank. My pulse raced as I reread the words, though they were already seared into my memories. You have 72 hours to tear down all unapproved buildings or face court action, penalties and forced demolition. Signed Westfield Reg HOA. My veins turned to ice. This wasn't merely a warning. It was a declaration of war, not only against me but against the property that had belonged to my family for 4 generations. My grandfather, a veteran of World War II, constructed this ranch using nothing but his own 2 hands. My father erected the Red Barn back in 1982. I built a greenhouse and a wooden chicken coop just last spring. Apparently the HOA disapproved of that. However, they made a critical error. They forgot who actually held title to the ground beneath their upscale coal, D-Sacks HOA pavilions and picnic areas. 3 days later, with assistance from the county records office, the property tax assessor and a contact in commercial real estate, I increased their rent 3-fold. Yes, their entire A clubhouse, their fitness center, the small plot of ground under their tennis courts. I legally possessed it all. They had been renting it for $1 annually under an old 99-year family lease my great-grandfather had signed. That lease had expired the previous Thursday. They demanded I demolish my ranch within 72 hours. I gave them 30 days to pay triple rent or evacuate the land where their precious facilities were located. The HOA president, Diane Langford, almost collapsed when I personally delivered the paperwork. Her hands shook as she attempted to steady her phone and threatened to involve their legal team. But I had already consulted with legal counsel. I smiled at her, calm, cold, the type of smile that only appears after you've been pushed around once too often. Then I leaned closer and said, "You assumed I was merely a rancher. You should have researched more thoroughly." That's when the shouting erupted from behind the HOA boardroom door. But how did this situation even develop? Let me take you back before the notice, before the threats, before Diane Langford and her HOA associates attempted to destroy my life. Because this conflict didn't begin with legal papers or tripled rent. It started with a horse, a loud rooster, and a glass of lemonade. My name is Travis Carter. I'm 41 years old and live in Pinewood County, Colorado, right at the border of the Westfield Ridge development. My ranch covers a modest 12 acres, but it's my source of pride. I raise chickens, maintain beehives, and house several horses. I even conduct riding lessons for neighborhood children on weekends. It's tranquil, or at least it used to be. The actual story began approximately 4 months before the notice arrived, when I first encountered Diane Langford. Diane was the recently elected president of Westfield Ridge, and she certainly carried herself like she owned the world. She had a blonde bob haircut, wore crisp pastel suits, carried clipboards tucked under one arm, and had condemnation in her gaze. Her husband Howard was more reserved, tall, bald, always trailing 3 steps behind her, typically wearing a forced smile like someone who had surrendered all his fights years earlier. They appeared without warning one Saturday morning while I was nailing fresh boards onto the chicken enclosure. Diane didn't greet me. She simply surveyed the area and declared, "We've received complaints about the noise. Is that a rooster?" I looked at Billy, my proud old Rhode Island red, who crowed again as if perfectly timed. "Certainly is," I replied. "Part of the ranch." Diane made a disapproving sound and wrote something down. Howard attempted to be cordial. "It's a beautiful property you have here. Real rustic appeal." I nodded. "Thanks. My grandfather established it." Being in the family since of 49, Diane wasn't interested. She was already examining the fence line like a health inspector with a mission. "We'll need to discuss that coop," she said. "I don't believe it received approval from the HOA Architectural Committee." I set down my hammer. "I'm not part of your OA." She paused. "Excuse me. This ranch is private property, not part of Westfield Ridge. Never joined." She froze momentarily, then regained composure with a strained smile. "Well, your property adjoins the community, and some of our residents have expressed concerns about noise, odors. One child claimed your horses frightened her. They're secured in a fenced paddock." She glanced again at Billy the rooster, who crowed as if he was enjoying this. "I'm simply informing you," she said, her voice becoming tighter, "that we'll be monitoring the situation." And with that, Diane pivoted and marched away, Howard shuffling behind her. That was our first encounter. The second time was more problematic. It was early spring, and I had opened the ranch gates for a neighborhood fundraiser. Pony rides for children, lemonade, and some games. I even invited some of the Westfield Ridge residents. It was intended to build connections. That's when I met Sarah Morgan, a single mother from the HOA community. She arrived with her daughter Abby, who was 7 and fighting leukemia. Abby was pale, quiet, and clung to her mother's side until she spotted the horses. Then her face brightened. "May she ride?" asked. "Even just a gentle walk?" I smiled. "Absolutely." That day Abby rode my most gentle mare Daisy. She giggled throughout the entire ride. Sarah wept quietly on the bench. After the ride, Abby insisted on feeding Daisy carrots. Diane appeared halfway through. She didn't smile, didn't wave. She stormed over to me, red-faced. "Travis, did you obtain permits for this? It's just a friendly community event. You have vendors, you have rides. Do you even carry insurance?" I handed her a copy of my ranch's liability coverage. She wasn't expecting that. Then I offered her lemonade. She declined. 3 days later, a letter arrived: violation of zoning regulations, unauthorized events, unpermitted structures. It wasn't from the county, it was on HOA letterhead. That's when I realized this wasn't about regulations. It was personal. She disliked the ranch, the animals, or perhaps it was that the children loved this place more than the HOA playground with its artificial mulch and broken swing. Over the following weeks it escalated. Complaints about roosters, reports of loose bees near the community pool. One neighbor claimed my goats were staring threateningly through his fence. Then came the notice: demolish it, 72 hours, no court order, no sheriff's badge, just paper. I could have panicked. Instead I went investigating. And I struck gold. It turns out that back in 1927, my great-grandfather James Carter had signed a lease with the town to allow a small section of his land to be used for community recreation purposes. It had been renewed once in 1949 for 99 years. That lease expired 4 days before the notice arrived. And guess what now stood on that land? The HOA clubhouse, gym, tennis courts, a picnic lawn, all of it. Legally, it was mine again. That's when I made my move. A lawyer helped me file the reversion paperwork. Then I drafted a new lease of $3,000 monthly, triple the original rent, which no one had paid in decades. I hand-delivered it to Diane. She opened it with trembling hands. You can't do this. I already have. Howard looked at me like he wanted to express gratitude, but Diane's face contorted. We'll see you in court, will you? I said. I've already reserved the date. Behind the boardroom doors, the shouting began, followed by a loud crash, then silence, until someone screamed. What do you mean we're trespassing? But that was just the beginning. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, because things are about to become wild. We haven't even begun to scratch the surface yet. The day after I delivered the new lease, I awoke to discover my front gate wide open and one of my signs destroyed. It was a small wooden sign I had painted myself. Welcome to Carter Ranch. It's 1949. It meant nothing to most people, but to me, it was a tribute to every calloused hand and early morning that built this place. Now it was lying on the gravel road, snapped cleanly in half. I didn't become angry, not then. I simply picked it up, brushed it off, and quietly hammered it back to the fence post. Then I did what every Carter man before me would have done. I saddled my horse, checked on my hens, and went about my chores. But the silence that morning wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive. I could sense eyes on me from the HOA walking path that bordered the back end of my pasture, from the second-story windows of the homes nearest to my fence. People were watching, waiting to see what I would do. Diane hadn't responded to the new lease notice. No call, no email, no payment. But I wasn't waiting around. I was building my case. I went to the county courthouse, pulled every document related to the original land lease, every zoning map, every property line. I highlighted everything. I photographed the HOA facilities sitting on my property. I documented every day they failed to respond. Meanwhile, things became tense in the neighborhood. Some people from Westfield Ridge started acting strangely around me. A man named Phil Jacobs, one of the HOA board members, walked his dog by the ranch every morning like clockwork. But after the lease delivery, he started quickening his pace when he passed, pulling his golden retriever like they were escaping a crime scene. Another woman, Jessica Crane, who once brought her son over to visit my baby goats, now looked at me like I was holding a flamethrower instead of a feed bucket. But not everyone had turned against me. One afternoon, I heard the crunch of gravel and turned to see Sarah Morgan's old Toyota pull into the drive. Abby was in the passenger seat, wrapped in a little pink blanket, her head bald from treatments, but her eyes still glowing when she saw the horses. Sarah got out and walked over slowly. I heard what they're doing to you, she said. It's not right. I smiled. They picked a fight they don't understand. She looked down, biting her lip. They told me if I supported you, I'd lose access to the HOA Kids Fund. That's how I pay for Abby's art therapy. My jaw clenched. That was low even for Diane. I told her. No HOA needed. That night, I hosted another small event. Just 3 families, no signs, no banners, just campfire, marshmallows, and pony rides under the stars. I didn't ask for permission, I didn't tell anyone. But I saw shadows watching from across the pasture. The next morning there was another envelope. This one was red. It said I was being sued by the HOA for interference with community peace, illegal gatherings, and property encroachment. It was a joke, but jokes can cost money. I called my lawyer, Camila Ortega, tough as nails woman who grew up working cattle in Texas before becoming the sharpest legal mind in the county. She laughed when she read the HOA complaint. They're shooting blanks, she said. But they want to scare you, drain you, drag you down. I'm not scared, I said. I'm just tired. Camilla nodded. Then we fight smart. Over the next week, we gathered more evidence, photos, records, testimonies from people who had been bullied by the HOA. And then something unexpected happened. One morning a stranger showed up at my gate, a tall, lanky guy in a Denver Broncos jacket, sipping from a coffee thermos. You Travis? He asked. I nodded. My name's Ethan Wells. I'm a land assessor. Got hired to reevaluate property lines out here. By who? He hesitated. The HOA? Of course they think they can redraw the lines. I asked. Ethan chuckled. They're grasping, but I had to come. He walked the perimeter with me, took notes. But at the end he said, for what it's worth, your case is solid. If anything, they're the ones trespassing. I thanked him. He paused before leaving. You know, Diane's been president here for 5 years, but lately people are talking. Some of them are tired of the drama. I raised an eyebrow. You mean the homeowners? He nodded. There are whispers of a recall vote. That was interesting and something I could use later. That afternoon, I drove into town to check on my feed order. When I returned, there was a commotion near the edge of my property. Several HOA members were gathered by the fence line shouting. As I got closer, I saw 2 sheriff's deputies standing between them and my ranch hand Luis. Luis was a quiet guy, mid-30s, reliable. He worked weekends and helped with the horses. He looked shaken. They tried to come onto the ranch, he said. I told them to stop. One of them shoved me. The deputies confirmed that no one had crossed the actual fence line, but tensions were rising. You might want to put up a camera, one deputy said, or a no trespassing sign. I thanked them, but my gut churned. This wasn't just petty anymore, it was getting dangerous. That night I barely slept. Every creak outside made me get up and look out the window. I kept my rifle nearby, not to use it but just in case someone forgot that this was still private land. Then came the morning that changed everything. I was out feeding the horses when I heard tires crunching up the gravel. I looked up to see a city vehicle followed by a black SUV. Diane stepped out of the SUV, so did two men in suits. One of them held a file folder. "Mr. Carter," he said, "we've come to serve you with a temporary cease and desist order. The HOA is filing for an emergency injunction." I blinked. "On what grounds?" "That your land use is causing distress to the community, that you're interfering with community functions, that your structures pose a safety hazard." He handed me the file. Camila was already on speaker before they pulled away. "They're bluffing," she said. "But we can't ignore it." I looked at the papers and then I looked beyond them toward the clubhouse, the gym, and the tennis courts that all sat on land they no longer owned. "All right," I said quietly. "Time to play their game." The next morning, I walked to the clubhouse fence with a big white sign under my arm. I nailed it to a post just before sunrise. It read, "Notice private land, lease terms expired, access revoked until payment received. Trespassers will be prosecuted." The show board met that night in a panic. The next morning, something even bigger happened. Someone had chained the clubhouse doors shut with real iron chains. A bright orange notice was stapled to the door, "Locked due to unpaid rent, by order of property owner." Diane called the police, but the police couldn't do a thing because legally, I was right, and that's when she completely snapped. Right there in front of cameras, because a local news truck had shown up too. I watched from my fence line, arms folded. This was far from over, but it was finally my turn to fight back, and the next move, let's just say it was going to be loud and permanent. It was just after dawn when the rumble of heavy machinery broke the silence. The sun was barely peeking over the ridge when I opened my front door to the sight of a bulldozer and two flatbed trucks pulling onto the edge of my property. Specifically, the sliver of land that extended behind the HOA's beloved tennis courts and gym. They weren't mine, they were sent by Diane Langford. And trailing them like a royal procession was Diane herself, standing tall in her pastel blue pantsuit, arms crossed, lips tight. Beside her was Phil Jacobs from the board and one of the HOA's lawyers, same guy from the cease and desist. Diane was grinning like the devil on Sunday. "Travis," she called out cheerfully, "I'm just letting you know, since you claim to be the legal landowner, we've decided to clean up the place a bit, remove some of your unsightly debris if that's even allowed." The bulldozer's engine growled to life. I didn't move. I didn't blink. Instead, I lifted my phone. "Smile," I said. "You just officially committed trespassing and unauthorized use of private land." Click. I got it all. The trucks, the people, the smug faces, the timestamp. They had crossed onto my side of the line. By noon, Camila had filed a temporary restraining order against the OA board's executive members, halting all activity near the disputed property. But it was too late for one thing. They had already torn up the west pasture fence, a part of the original Carter boundary line built by my grandfather. When I saw it lying in splinters, something in me snapped. This wasn't just a battle over land anymore, this was war. I called in favors, big ones. That afternoon, 3 massive commercial development survey trucks rolled up my gravel road, followed by a fleet of contractors. These weren't random workers. These were urban developers I'd partnered with during the last real estate downturn. People who owed me more than a few favors. Diane saw them from across the road. She marched back down with Howard trailing behind, his face pale. "Travis," she barked, "what exactly are you doing now?" I looked at her and smiled. "I'm preparing the land for development." Her mouth opened, closed. "This is ranch land." "Was ranch land," I corrected. "Now I'm thinking a few rental units, a little commercial space, maybe a farmer's market. You know, the kind of thing that blocks your tennis court view." "You wouldn't." "I would." The HOA members panicked. Diane's phone rang constantly. I heard her yelling at someone, maybe Phil, maybe the lawyer, maybe the mayor. None of it mattered because within days, the local newspaper picked up the story, a feature titled "Rancher Fights Back Against OA Tyranny." And he owns the land they're standing on. And just like that, public opinion flipped. Locals loved it. Social media went wild, memes, hashtags, even a t-shirt that said, "Don't mess with Carter Ranch." But just as things looked like they were turning, something happened that knocked the wind out of me. A call came in from the county inspector's office. The voice on the other end was stern. "Mr. Carter, we received a tip. Your barn is being used for public events without a safety clearance. We are required to perform an immediate inspection. You'll need to shut it down until further notice." That meant I couldn't host the local kids, couldn't run riding sessions, couldn't let Abby or any of the others back in. I hung up the phone and sat there, quiet. The low point I hadn't expected had hit like a train. Sarah showed up later that evening with a basket of fresh bread and a worried look. "They're trying to break you?" she said. "But you're not alone, Travis." I didn't have the heart to argue. I just looked at the barn, empty, quiet, cold, like they had managed to drain the soul out of it with one phone call. That night, I walked the pasture alone, just me and the wind, until I saw something in the dark. At first, I thought it was a coyote, but then I heard giggling. 3 teens were on the HOA tennis court sneaking in after curfew. One of them yelled, "This place sucks now. Can't even use the gym. My mom says we're moving." Another laughed, "We should set the dumb place on fire." They were joking, but it hit me hard. Deanne's choices were hurting everyone, not just me. The next morning, I sent Camila an email, "Let's go public everything, all of it." She called me 5 minutes later. "You sure?" "Positive." Be noon. We had delivered a complete press kit to 3 news outlets, including original lease documents, video of Diane's bulldozers trespassing, the torn fence, and even the kids' testimonies about how much the ranch meant to them. The local TV station ran a prime time special that night. The headline: Community Hero or HOA Victim. The Carter Ranch Battle that's dividing Westfield Ridge. The story was fair, honest. It showed Abby feeding my horse, showed Diane yelling at Camel on courthouse steps, showed footage of the gym chain shut in the land deeds I now held. Within 24 hours, the HOA's Facebook page was flooded. Comments, angry emojis, calls for Diane's resignation. But Diane didn't back down. Instead, she doubled down. The very next morning, a moving truck showed up in front of her house. Not hers, mine. Someone had filed a fake report with a private relocation company, claiming that the ranch was being repossessed. They started backing into my driveway before I stopped them at the gate. The driver, confused, said, "We got a service order." Said everything needed to be cleared off this land by 400 p.m. I pulled out the deed, showed him the press article, told him the truth. He cursed and said, "Someone's gonna pay for this prank." I didn't doubt it. But, as I stood there watching the truck pull away, my phone buzzed. Camila. She sounded breathless, excited. "Travis, the county just posted the decision." "What decision?" "On the cease and desist." I held my breath. "It's been thrown out. They ruled it was based on biased complaints and personal vendettas from the HOA. Your land rights are secure. You're free to resume all operations." I sat down on the porch steps. The barn could open again. The kids could return. Abby could ride Daisy. But just as I smiled for the first time in days, Camila said one last thing. "There's more." I looked up. More. "They've scheduled a formal investigation into Westfield Ridge HOA. Misuse of funds, voter suppression. You started something bigger than you realize." And just like that, the battle had grown into something else entirely. Not just a fight for my land, but for every neighbor who had ever been bullied, ignored, or pushed aside by power, hungry HO leaders. And Deanne? She was running out of places to hide. The next few days were unlike anything I'd ever lived through. My quiet ranch had become the center of a storm. News vans showed up at dawn, drones buzzed over the pasture, people I didn't even know were stopping by just to shake my hand and say, "Thank you for standing up to them." But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a man hanging on by a thread. I couldn't enjoy the attention. Not with the way Diane was moving in the shadows. Despite the public pressure and calls for her resignation, Diane hadn't stepped down. In fact, she'd gone full ice queen. The HOA meetings were now held behind closed doors. No minutes were posted online. Homeowners who asked questions were met with vague emails and pending investigations. But then came the breaking point. One evening, as the sun was dipping low and the barn glowed gold in the light, Sarah called me, panic in her voice. "Travis, they canceled the community garden." "What?" "They said the land use agreement was void. They're blaming you." My stomach dropped. The garden sat right at the edge of the Carter property. For years it had been maintained by local residents, mostly retirees and single moms who grew vegetables, herbs, and flowers. It was one of the few good things the HOA had done. But the truth, that garden was also on my reclaimed land. I hadn't said a word about it, not once, because I believed in what it did for the community. And now Diane was weaponizing it, claiming I had revoked permission, a flat-out lie. That night I walked to the garden. The gate was padlocked. A sign hung on it in big, bold letters, "Closed by order of landowner. Trespassers will be prosecuted." I hadn't written that. I stood there, heart thudding, as a small group of residents gathered, muttering angrily, "Wes Travis wants to bulldoze everything." I knew he was just doing this for attention. I should have known he'd ruin it for everyone. I turned. Sarah was behind me, her face pale. "You didn't do this, did you?" "No," I whispered. Then I took out my keys and snapped the padlock open. A few people gasped. "This garden is yours?" I said, loud enough for all of them to hear. "No one told me you had to leave. In fact, I was going to help fund a greenhouse next season." Someone asked, "But the sign?" "I didn't write that." Diane did. The silence hung heavy. Then, one by one, people started walking into the garden again. Planting, watering, restoring. But that lie changed something. I realized Deanne wasn't just fighting me anymore. She was trying to turn the entire community against me. And in some ways it was working. That night, someone egged my barn. The next morning I found broken beer bottles at the end of my driveway. One had a note stuffed inside, "Not everyone's on your side, ranch boy." I handed the note to Camila. She frowned. "It's time we show them what you're really made of." "How?" "We're not just going to expose Diane, we're going to outvote her." That was the plan. According to HOA bylaws, if 25% of homeowners signed a petition, they could force a special election to remove the board president. Camila and a few volunteers, including Sarah and Louise, got to work canvassing door to door, house by house. Some people slammed their doors, others signed eagerly. But the real moment of hope came when a woman named Helen Douglas, one of the oldest residents in Westfield Ridge, opened her door. Helen was sharp, wise, and not easily fooled. I knew Diane was trouble when she started finding my grandson for chalk drawings on my own driveway. She said, signing the form without hesitation, "You just make sure you don't become her on the other side of this." That stuck with me. Don't become her. A few days later, we had 73 signatures, just enough. The HOA board was forced to announce a recall vote for Diane Langford in 21 days. It was on. And that's when she pulled her most extreme move yet. Diane filed a lawsuit against me personally, claiming emotional distress, slander, and loss of community value. The suit demanded $500,000 in damages. $500,000. I read it at the kitchen table, my hands shaking. This wasn't just a power play anymore. It was a full-scale attack. Camila showed up within the hour. She read the suit, sighed, then said, "We'll crush this in court, but we need to make it public." So I agreed to one interview, just one. It aired the next night, a quiet sit, down with a local journalist in front of my barn. I told the story from the start about my grandfather, the lease, the threats, the lies, the garden, and finally the lawsuit. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just told the truth. And at the end of the segment, the journalist asked me, if you could say one thing to Diane right now, what would it be? I looked at the camera and I said, I'd say thank you. Thank you for reminding me what this land really stands for, not just tradition but community, and I'm not going anywhere. The interview went viral. Support poured in. Dozens more HOA residents who hadn't signed the petition before showed up at my gate, asking how they could vote. One woman brought cookies. Another dropped off a jar of homemade pickles. Sarah cried when she saw the line of neighbors asking how to help. But then, 3 days before the vote, someone set fire to the tool shed behind my barn. It wasn't big, it didn't spread. The fire department got there in time. But the message was clear: this wasn't over, not by a long shot. And the next chapter would start with a criminal investigation. The sky was still dark when I smelled the smoke. Not a campfire, not barbecue, burning wood, char, melted plastic. I threw on my boots and ran toward the back of the barn where the tool shed sat. By the time I got there, flames were licking up the walls like angry fingers. The air was hot and dry, thick with black smoke. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the hose and turned it full blast, shouting for Lewis, who came running from the bunkhouse barefoot, still pulling on his shirt. We fought it for 10 minutes before the fire truck came barreling down the drive. The firefighters took over, and I stepped back, coughing, my hands shaking. The shed was a total loss. All the tools, the feed bins, a saddle I'd owned since I was a boy, gone. But thank God it hadn't spread to the barn. The fire chief was a guy I knew, Tommy Grant, a good man who'd played ball with me back in high school. He walked up adjusting his helmet. Travis, this wasn't an accident. I swallowed hard. You sure? Accelerant near the door. Shed doesn't even have electricity. Someone said this. And just like that, everything got real. This wasn't vandalism, this was arson. The sheriff's deputies came out a few minutes later. Flashlights swept the perimeter. One of them found a gas can in the brush, half melted, fingerprints likely destroyed. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the note they found nailed to my chicken coop, scrawled in black marker on a ripped piece of cardboard: next time we won't miss. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't even sit down. I stayed up patrolling the ranch with my rifle strapped to my chest, flashlight in hand, every creak and rustle in the dark setting my nerves on edge. This wasn't a property fight anymore, this was personal, and I knew exactly who was behind it. No, I couldn't prove Diane had lit the match, but I knew her fingerprints were all over the hatred she had sown. Her words, her lies, her twisting of facts and rules to get people to fear me, hate me. And now someone had taken that hatred to fire and threats. The next morning I called Camila. She listened quietly as I told her everything. We're pressing charges, she said firmly. We'll subpoena HOA's security footage, gate logs, everything. I agreed, but I also told her something else. No matter what happens, I said, we go through with the recall vote. She paused. You sure you're up for that right now, Camila? I've never been more ready. 3 days later, Westfield Ridge was swarming with tension. Signs went up: vote yes to recall Diane. Flyers circulated. Volunteers made calls. Sarah, Louise, and even Helen Douglas stood at the entrance of the community handing out pamphlets. The HOA board tried to stop it. Phil Jacobs claimed the vote was illegal. Diane posted a video online calling it an attack on order and decency. But it was too late. The residents had spoken and the ballots were printed. Meanwhile, I made a quiet decision. I reopened the barn. No press, no fanfare, just kids. Abby showed up with a sketchbook and a big smile. Is Daisy okay? She's perfect, I said, lifting her up onto the saddle. The barn filled with laughter again, Sarah hugging me before she left. No matter what happens, you gave this back to us. And I held on to that because I needed it. The day of the vote was tense. Cars lined the streets. Neighbors whispered. People who'd barely spoken to each other before stood together in line. I stayed home. This wasn't my election, it was theirs. That evening, Camila showed up with a huge grin and a stack of folded papers. Well, she dropped them on the table. 76% voted yes. I blinked. She's out, she's out. Diane Langford has been officially recalled as OA president. I sat down, stunned. It was done. The tyrant was gone. The ranch was safe. Or so I thought, because just as we were about to breathe again, Camila's phone buzzed. She picked it up, frowned, then handed it to me. It's the county clerk, she said. You need to hear this. I put the phone to my ear. Mr. Carter, a voice said, we need you to come down to the office. There's been a challenge filed against your property ownership. Someone submitted an old deed claiming that part of your land was improperly transferred decades ago. If it holds, you could lose everything. I sat there frozen. The war wasn't over. Diane might have been gone, but now someone worse had stepped in to finish what she started. The cold office of the county clerk smelled like dust and